I thought our fourth wedding anniversary would be the kind of night you photograph for Christmas cards. Warm string lights across our backyard. Food arriving right on time. My parents laughing with his parents like they'd finally learned how to share the same air without tension. I had spent weeks helping plan the guest list with my husband because we both agreed on one thing. This party wasn't about showing off. It was about celebrating us. 4 years married, 7 years together. The quiet proof that we'd built something real. At 6:20 p.m., the first guests started arriving. I was at the door, smiling until my cheeks hurt, accepting hugs, taking compliments about the decorations, pretending I wasn't nervous that something would go wrong. And then a woman I didn't recognize walked in beside Sarah, one of my husband Mason's college friends. She didn't hover like a +1 who felt awkward. She moved like she belonged there. I watched her cross the yard with this calm confidence, and something in my stomach tightened before my brain could catch up. She went straight to Mason, straight to my husband, like she already knew the shortest path to him. And Mason hugged her. Not a polite hug, not a nice to see you hug, a long one. The kind that has history in it. The kind that makes you feel like you just walked into the middle of a conversation that started years ago. I remember the exact moment the name clicked in my head, like a lock turning. Leah, the ex-fiancée he told me about when we first started dating. The woman he'd been with for 3 years. The one he said he hadn't seen in 6 years because she'd moved to Seattle after their breakup. The past he'd always described in calm, neutral sentences like it was a closed chapter. But there she was, standing in my backyard, smiling at my husband like the chapter had never ended, just paused. Mason introduced her to me, and the words that came out of his mouth made my skin go cold. "This is Leah," he said, like it was normal, like she was just Sarah's friend. He didn't say my ex. He didn't say the woman I almost married. And as the party continued around me, laughter, clinking glasses, music, I realized I was the only person who didn't know what was really happening in my own marriage. Before Leah showed up in my backyard like a ghost with perfect hair, I would have sworn, hand on my chest, that my marriage was built on the kind of trust people spend their whole lives chasing. My name is Brianna. I'm 34, and I work as a project coordinator for a mid-sized company. Enough responsibility to keep my brain buzzing, enough stability to pay bills on time without holding my breath. I'm not the jealous type. I've never been. I grew up watching adults turn suspicion into sport, whispered accusations at family gatherings, partners checking each other's phones like they were border security. I promised myself I would never build a life like that. My husband is Mason, 32. He's friendly in a way that makes rooms relax. The kind of man who remembers the names of people's dogs, who jokes with cashiers, who texts his mom back even when he's busy. When we met, I was fresh out of a relationship that had drained me. And Mason felt easy, like I could exhale around him. We met at a friend's birthday dinner, one of those long tables at a noisy restaurant where you end up talking to whoever you're seated next to. He offered to swap seats because I was stuck at the end with a wobbly chair. I laughed, and he grinned like he'd just won something. We spent most of the night talking over the music, work, movies, where we'd grown up. When I got home, I realized I'd been smiling in the car like an idiot. We dated for 3 years before we got married, not because either of us was afraid, just because life was busy, and we didn't want to rush it. We moved in together after a year. We learned each other's habits. I fold towels like a military drill. He leaves cabinet doors open like he's allergic to closing anything. We fought sometimes, about dishes, about money, about how he could fall asleep in 30 seconds while I needed a whole ritual, but it always ended with the same thing, honesty. Talking until we were tired, then talking again. Early on, Mason told me about Leah. He framed it like a story that had already been fully processed. They were together 3 years, he said, engaged. But she called it off, said she wasn't ready for marriage and needed to focus on her career. He didn't sound bitter. He didn't sound like he was still bleeding. He sounded neutral, like it was something that happened to a different version of him. He said she moved to Seattle soon after. Job opportunity, new start, no contact. I remember asking carefully, "Do you still talk?" He shook his head without hesitation. "No, that's done." And I believed him, because he never brought her up unless it came up naturally. Like when we drove past a restaurant and he said, "Oh, Leah used to hate seafood," and then immediately laughed at himself like he'd accidentally picked up an old receipt from a pocket. Nothing emotional, nothing lingering. That's why my guard stayed down. That's also why our anniversary party felt safe to plan. We hadn't done anything big for previous anniversaries. Work stress, budget constraints, the usual. This year, we wanted to celebrate properly. Not lavish, just meaningful. A backyard party with family, close friends, and a few neighbors we'd grown close to. We talked about the guest list more than once. Mason even teased me about being too organized because I kept double-checking names and numbers like I was managing a wedding again. Only people who matter to both of us, I said. He nodded. Exactly. He handled the catering and decorations. I handled invites and timelines. It became this little teamwork bubble that made me feel proud, like we were one of those couples who actually functioned. I didn't know that while I was picking napkin colors, there was a whole other thread of reality running underneath my life. Quiet, hidden, waiting. And the worst part? If Leah hadn't walked through that gate at 6 o'clock sharp, I might have stayed ignorant a lot longer. After Leah walked into our backyard that evening, something in the air shifted. Not the loud, obvious kind of tension, but the quiet, insidious kind that coils around your chest and makes breathing feel like a negotiation. I tried to focus on greeting guests, smiling at old neighbors, making small talk. But every laugh I heard from Mason and Leah sliced through me, like a memory I hadn't yet processed. I'd always thought my marriage with Mason was solid because he had never given me reason to doubt him. He was consistent, reliable, present. But watching him interact with Leah, I realized how little I knew about this side of his life, this history that suddenly felt alive again. The casual ease with which they reminisced about college stories, inside jokes, things that only the two of them would remember. It was like watching a door open that I didn't even know existed. Over the next few weeks, the tension didn't disappear. It grew quietly, almost invisibly. Mason insisted everything was innocent. "She's just an old friend," he'd say, tossing me a smile that should have reassured me, but didn't. And I wanted to believe him, truly, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I started noticing things I might have dismissed before. The way Mason seemed unusually excited to attend group gatherings with Leah. Not excited exactly, but anticipatory. Like he was looking forward to something I wasn't allowed to see. How casually he would mention events with college friends, without naming Leah directly, and how he laughed at stories that clearly involved her, yet offered no context. The subtle way he would check his phone whenever I entered the room, though he swore it was nothing. It was a small seed of doubt, but it grew fast. I felt myself shrinking, second-guessing, replaying every interaction for hidden meanings. My stomach twisted in knots, my heart jumped without warning, and my hands unconsciously clenched and unclenched whenever Mason mentioned Leah in passing. Then there were the moments that landed harder. I caught Mason's phone screen once, by accident, a group chat with his college friends. And there it was. Leah mentioned multiple times, casual, friendly messages, but messages that hadn't been mentioned to me at all. Not one word about catching up for coffee, about drinks, about movie nights. Every interaction was hidden, carefully curated so that I wouldn't know. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't want to make accusations, not yet. I needed clarity. But the unease gnawed at me, the trust I had built slowly corroding in the background. I began replaying high school traumas, how easily things could spiral, how betrayal had felt sharp in public, and how, as a child, I had learned to swallow my own pain so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I recognized the patterns forming: secrecy, omission, the soft smile that says everything is fine while your heart screams otherwise. Even more unsettling was the internal debate I started having. Was I imagining danger where there was none? Was I being paranoid, jealous, controlling? Mason had done nothing physically wrong. There were no romantic gestures, no kisses in hidden corners, but my intuition screamed. Something was being protected from me for a reason, and that very protection, the secrecy itself, was the betrayal. Every family dinner, every casual mention of Leah, every unnoticed glance at his phone became a trigger. My mind would flash back to the backyard that night, the hug that should have been innocuous but carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My pulse would rise, my stomach would churn, and I would wrestle with whether to speak up or to wait. The quiet escalation continued. Friends and family began to notice the tension too. I could feel their curiosity, their silent questioning, and I realized, with a sinking weight, that what started as a subtle unease was beginning to take over my life. The anniversary party had been meant to celebrate love and trust, but instead it had planted the first seed of conflict that would consume the months ahead. The real rupture didn't happen at the party. It happened the morning after, when I finally confronted Mason alone in the quiet of our living room. The air smelled faintly of leftover candles and cold coffee, the remnants of our carefully planned celebration. I had been pacing for 15 minutes before I finally said it. "Why didn't you tell me Levi was going to be here?" Mason froze, mid-sip of his coffee, and looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Levi?" he asked, genuinely confused, and I felt the twist of betrayal tighten in my chest. "Yes, Levi, your ex, the man you told me you hadn't seen in years. Why did you let him come to our anniversary party without saying a word to me?" His brow furrowed. "Brianna, it was last minute. Sarah just said he was back in town. I didn't think it would be a big deal. He came with her." I took a sharp breath, gripping the arm of the sofa. "You didn't think it would be a big deal? Mason, he's your ex-fiancé. You introduced him as Sarah's friend. Not once, not ever, did you acknowledge who he really is." He set his coffee down slowly, trying to maintain calm. "I didn't want to make a scene. I thought it would be fine, honestly. It's Levi. It's harmless. He's changed. We're adults." "Adults?" My voice trembled with the edge of disbelief. "Adults don't lie by omission. Adults don't invite their ex to our anniversary and pretend it's casual." My throat tightened, and for a moment I felt a surge of anger so sharp it made my ears ring. Mason ran a hand through his hair. "Bree, I'm sorry. I honestly didn't mean to upset you. It really was just a last-minute thing. I didn't think—" "You didn't think," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my best effort to stay calm. "You didn't think about my feelings. You didn't think about the trust between us. You didn't think about anything besides avoiding awkwardness." His hands trembled slightly. "I didn't want to make a problem out of nothing." I shook my head, incredulous. "Nothing?" Mason, the entire evening felt like a betrayal. The laughter, the inside jokes, the way you two interacted like nothing had ever changed. Do you have any idea how that made me feel? He sighed and sank into the chair across from me. His shoulders slumped. The first crack in his composure. "I didn't think it would feel that way. I thought he was harmless, that we could both move on. I didn't know it would hit you like this." "Move on?" I spat the words, though my voice quavered under the weight of everything bottled up. "You've been seeing him at group gatherings for months, Mason. You didn't tell me. You didn't even mention it in passing. And now you expect me to believe it's harmless? That it's nothing?" He flinched, and for a moment I saw the man I married. The man who used to smile at me like I was the only person in the room. The man who once held my hand during thunderstorms. But that image collided violently with the man who had allowed secrecy to grow between us, feeding it with omission and half-truths. I could feel my heart pounding, hot in my chest, my hands curling into fists. The quiet dread I'd been carrying for weeks erupted. I felt the betrayal, sharp and jagged, sliced through every layer of trust I had painstakingly built. The anniversary, our celebration of love and partnership, had been a facade, a trapdoor, and I had fallen through it blind. "You don't understand," I whispered, though it felt like shouting. "This isn't just about Levi being at a party. It's about months of secrecy. It's about lying to me about your friendships, about hiding what you've been doing while I thought we were building a life together." Mason's lips parted, but no words came. His gaze fell to the floor, and in that silence, I felt the full weight of everything, every casual omission, every conversation he had with Levi I didn't know about. Every shared laugh that wasn't mine to share. For the first time in years, I didn't just question his honesty. I questioned the foundation of our marriage itself. Every shared plan, every decision we'd made together, suddenly felt tainted by what had been kept from me. I left the living room that morning to breathe, my hands trembling. I didn't know yet if this was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of a fight to save something that might already be broken beyond repair. After that morning confrontation, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath me shaky and uncertain. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything except the gnawing question, how much of our life together has been real if he could hide this from me for months? I spent the day wandering through our home in a haze. Every picture on the wall, every memento on the shelves suddenly felt like a lie. The anniversary cards we'd received, the notes from friends, the photos from past vacations, they were all there, mocking me. You thought you knew him. You thought you were safe. I tried to calm myself, taking deep, uneven breaths. But it wasn't just anger, it was betrayal, sharp and all-consuming. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water, my throat tight. I thought about all the small signs I had ignored, the extra time he spent at group gatherings, the subtle smiles when certain people were mentioned, the casual way he laughed at stories that seemed to have layers I couldn't access. I'd brushed them off, told myself I was overreacting. And yet the truth was undeniable. I had been intentionally left in the dark. I texted my best friend Diane, my lifeline, in moments of confusion and despair. I couldn't form coherent sentences at first. The messages came out in fragments. He lied. Months. Coffee dates. Anniversary party. I don't know what's real anymore. Diane responded immediately, calm and grounding. Breathe. You're not overreacting. This isn't about jealousy. This is about respect, about honesty. Her words were a small anchor in the storm. I needed that anchor, because my internal dialogue was spinning out of control. I found myself questioning not only Mason, but myself. Had I been naive, too trusting, blind? And then guilt surfaced, sharp and bitter. Maybe this is my fault. Maybe I didn't notice sooner. Maybe I pushed him away without realizing it. I spent hours replaying the events, analyzing every conversation. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe Mason genuinely didn't think it was a big deal. Maybe he didn't understand how his actions, or inactions, affected me. But even as I searched for excuses, a deeper realization settled in. The pattern was what hurt most. Not just the anniversary party, but the ongoing secrecy. It wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate choice to hide, to curate what I knew. By evening, I knew I had to face him again, to confront the truth before it festered any longer. I sat in the living room, heart hammering, hands gripping the edges of the sofa. When Mason walked in, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his smile faltered. He tried to speak, but I held up my hand. I need honesty, I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. No excuses, no minimization. I need to know everything about your interactions with Levi over the past few months. Every coffee, every text, every meeting you didn't tell me about. Mason's eyes widened, and I felt the shift, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again. Brianna, Don't just lie. Not now, not ever again. My voice grew stronger, fueled by months of disbelief and betrayal. I realized that even if nothing physical had happened, the emotional landscape had been compromised. Trust, once fractured, can't be patched with half-truths. He nodded, finally, almost imperceptibly. I could see the conflict in him, the mix of shame, fear, and desperation. But seeing that didn't make it easier. It made it more real. After he left the room, I sank into the sofa, my body trembling. I felt drained, hollow, and yet, beneath it all, a strange sense of clarity began to form. I didn't need to scream, to cry, to fight. I needed to decide, could I rebuild from this, or was this a line that had been crossed too many times to recover from? I called Diane again, letting her listen as I poured everything out. She didn't offer cliches or empty reassurances. She simply listened, held space for my confusion, my hurt, my anger. And in that listening, I realized I didn't have to make a decision immediately. I only had to acknowledge my feelings and face the reality of what had happened. The evening faded into night, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My stomach ached, my chest felt heavy, and my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. But somewhere in the chaos, a quiet voice whispered, "You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to demand honesty. You are allowed to feel betrayed." I didn't know yet if our marriage could survive this. I didn't know if Mason could repair the damage. But for the first time, I recognized that I wasn't powerless. That realization, small and fragile, was the first step toward reclaiming my life from secrecy and lies. The days after the confrontation became a whirlwind of tension, suspicion, and raw emotion. What had started as an isolated breach of trust, the surprise presence of Levi at our anniversary party, snowballed into something I could no longer ignore. The secret I'd stumbled upon had grown into a living, breathing force in our marriage, and it refused to be silenced. At first, Mason tried to reassure me. He promised transparency, showing me messages, deleting unnecessary chats, and even offering to share his calendar to prove he hadn't lied about other commitments. On the surface, it looked like cooperation, but every glance at his phone, every sudden text from friends, every small smile when Levi's name came up, cut deeper than any confrontation. It wasn't just what he had done, it was the months of intentional omission, the repeated choice to hide interactions with someone who had once been the center of his past. And then came the external pressure. Our friends, those who had been close with Mason since college, started noticing the tension between us. Casual questions like, "Are you okay with Levi hanging out with us?" Or, "You don't mind us inviting Levi to the barbecue, right?" Felt like knives in my chest. Each question assumed my silence, as though my discomfort was invalid. My voice, already raw from confronting Mason, felt drowned out in a sea of casual normalcy. I began withdrawing from social situations. Every invitation to a group gathering was now a calculated risk. I wanted to support my husband. I wanted to show maturity, control, composure, but my mind refused to quiet the alarms. They are hiding something from me. This isn't just harmless nostalgia. The tension escalated further when I accidentally discovered private messages between Mason and Levi. I had been tidying the living room and noticed his phone left unattended. Hesitation gripped me. I knew it was a violation, but the gnawing need for clarity overpowered doubt. What I saw made my stomach drop. Casual conversations about old memories were there, but layered beneath them were comments that felt flirtatious, subtle acknowledgments of the bond they had shared. Not explicit, not overt, but intimate enough to provoke a visceral reaction. When I confronted Mason about the messages, he immediately grew defensive. "They're just reminiscing. It's innocent. You're reading too much into it." "No, Mason," I said, my voice tight, trembling. "It's not the content. It's the hiding. You deliberately concealed these meetings, these conversations, for months. That is the problem." He shook his head, trying to rationalize, justify, explain. I didn't think it mattered. It wasn't romantic. I was just reconnecting with an old friend. The argument spiraled. Words flew like shards of glass. Betrayal, dishonesty, secrecy, emotional adultery. Every sentence carried a weight neither of us had experienced before. Our home, once a sanctuary, felt like a courtroom. Walls closed in. Voices echoed. My heart pounded in my ears. Mason's defensiveness only heightened my own alarm. He started involving his friends indirectly, asking them for advice about how to reassure Brianna. Some of them suggested I was overreacting, painting me as controlling or insecure. I felt a chilling isolation, the world framing me as unreasonable when, in truth, I had been ignored, lied to, and manipulated by omission. Even at work, I felt the tension lingering. My focus wavered. My mind replayed every smile Mason had given Levi, every subtle exchange I hadn't noticed in the past. Nights became restless, sleep fragmented. My body felt the betrayal in tight shoulders, shallow breaths, and a persistent pit of anxiety in my stomach. Mason, in turn, began retreating. Our conversations, when they happened, were clipped, cautious, like walking on fragile glass. I sensed his fear, not of losing me, but of the exposure, the confrontation, the scrutiny I demanded. He was defensive, evasive, apologetic in bursts, and then silent. That silence was heavier than any accusation. I began journaling, trying to untangle the chaos in my head. Writing became my lifeline, a way to reclaim clarity, to process the storm raging both in our home and in my mind. I listed every interaction, every lie of omission, every casual comment or meeting with Levi I had discovered. Seeing it all on paper crystallized the pattern. Months of deception, repeated reassurances of innocence, and constant minimization of my feelings. Friends tried to mediate. Diane called me almost daily, providing grounding and perspective. "Bree," she said once, "this isn't about jealousy. This is about your boundaries being ignored repeatedly. You're allowed to feel betrayed. You're allowed to demand honesty." Her words helped, but they couldn't stop the erosion happening inside me. Every group event Mason attended with Levi, every message exchanged, even after he promised transparency, felt like a reopening of wounds. Trust, the foundation of our marriage, was crumbling, replaced by suspicion, anxiety, and a constant calculation of what might be hidden next. By the end of the month, the situation had escalated beyond my control. Our arguments became longer, more intense. Minor disagreements ignited major emotional explosions. Mason's apologies, once sufficient, now felt hollow, repetitive, and unable to bridge the growing chasm. I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that this wasn't just a temporary conflict. This was a fundamental fracture. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The emotional betrayal, compounded by secrecy and manipulation by omission, had grown too large, too powerful to reconcile without radical honesty and boundaries. And in that moment, I knew I had to take control, not just of the situation, but of my own life. Weeks into the escalation, I reached a point where every familiar corner of my life felt alien. Our home, which had once been a place of comfort and laughter, now carried the weight of secrets, mistrust, and silent accusations. I walked from room to room, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage, my own life. The smallest sound, a laugh outside the bedroom door, a phone vibrating on the counter, sent my pulse racing. I was hyper-aware of everything, every interaction, every omission. I couldn't eat, not because of lack of appetite, but because my stomach felt tied in knots every time I tried. Sleep eluded me. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories, conversations, and subtle cues that I had once ignored. My mind refused to rest. I imagined Mason laughing with Levi at our anniversary party, over coffees I wasn't invited to, inside jokes I would never know. The thought burned in me like acid. Even reaching out to Diane offered little comfort. I told her everything, the secrecy, the lies, the one-on-one meetings with Levi that Mason had downplayed or outright denied. She held space for me, but even her support couldn't erase the hollow ache inside. I felt trapped between my loyalty to Mason, my own sense of justice, and the reality that trust, foundation of years of love, had been deliberately undermined. The breaking point came one evening when Mason tried to talk, trying to explain yet again, offering excuses about harmless reconnections and past friendships. I listened, every word slicing through me like cold glass. The voice inside my head shouted, "You're being gaslit. He's choosing deception. You're not imagining this." But part of me wanted to believe him, to hope that the man I married was still here, still worthy of my love. I realized then that hope was no longer enough. It had become a weapon of self-deception. I had been bending, forgiving, rationalizing, and excusing, because I loved him, because I wanted our marriage to work. But love without honesty, without transparency, had become a trap, and the trap was closing. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands gripping the sheets. Tears came unbidden, hot and sharp. I let them fall, even as my body shook with anger, fear, and exhaustion. I felt hollow, violated, not by physical acts, but by months of intentional omission and secrecy. Each lie, each hidden coffee date, each private message was a blade in my chest. I thought about what I had sacrificed over the years for this marriage. My energy, my trust, my peace of mind. And now, staring into the dark, I understood the cost, my sense of safety, my clarity, and the unshakable belief that Mason was fully on my side. It wasn't just the lies themselves, it was the ripple effect. I had started to doubt my own judgment, to question whether I was overreacting, whether my feelings were valid. I felt isolated, alone in a home that should have been a sanctuary. Friends tried to offer perspective, but even their words seemed distant, faint echoes compared to the intensity of the betrayal I felt. That night, I didn't sleep. I wandered through our home like a ghost, tracing memories in my mind. Our wedding day, our first apartment, vacations, the ordinary moments that once felt sacred. Each memory now carried the sting of deception. The laughter I had shared, the promises we made, they felt tainted, overshadowed by a secret life Mason had kept from me. I realized I had reached the bottom. The sense of safety, of mutual respect, of partnership, all of it had collapsed. I felt powerless, trapped between the love I still carried for Mason and the realization that the foundation of that love had been deliberately cracked. I could no longer ignore it, rationalize it, or hope it would go away. And yet beneath the crushing weight of betrayal, a spark remained. A quiet, stubborn voice whispered, "You deserve honesty. You deserve respect. You deserve to be seen and heard. You do not have to stay in this darkness." It was small, almost imperceptible, but it existed, and it was enough to plant the seed for the next step, the turning point where I would reclaim control of my life and confront the truth fully. I didn't realize it at first, but the turning point came quietly, like a sunrise creeping over a horizon I hadn't noticed. One afternoon, Mason left his laptop open while he stepped into the kitchen. I glanced at it out of habit, not curiosity, but instinct. I had learned, painfully, that ignoring my gut had always left me vulnerable. On the screen was a string of messages between Mason and Levi. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to read. And then, buried in casual greetings and reminiscing, I saw it. Plans for a one-on-one meeting that Mason had never mentioned. The dates aligned with nights when he had claimed to be working late or out with colleagues. My pulse spiked, and a cold clarity settled over me. This wasn't about innocent reconnections anymore. This was deliberate deception. I sat down heavily, hands pressed to my face. The betrayal, once a shadow looming over every interaction, now had a name and a pattern. For months, Mason had manipulated the narrative, controlling what I knew, hiding his intentions, and preserving the illusion that everything was harmless. I realized something critical in that moment. I had the power to reclaim my life, not through anger alone, not through passive frustration, but by facing the truth fully and deciding, consciously, where I stood. I called Diane immediately. Her voice, calm and unwavering, helped me focus. "It's real, Bree," she said, "and you have every right to act. You are not overreacting. This isn't about jealousy. This is about boundaries. This is about respect." Her words were the catalyst I needed. I would no longer let uncertainty rule me. I would confront Mason with evidence, demand complete transparency, and make a decision about my future on my own terms. That evening, I asked Mason to sit with me in the living room. I had printed screenshots, dates, and times, a factual account of the meetings and messages. I laid them out methodically on the coffee table, each one a mirror, reflecting the months of hidden behavior. His initial reaction was defensive. "Brianna, you're reading too much into this. It's just friendship. You know me." I shook my head, voice steady but firm. "No, Mason, this isn't about reading too much into it. This is about deliberate secrecy. You chose not to tell me about these meetings. You hid conversations with Levi. You allowed him to be part of your life without my knowledge while claiming everything was harmless." His face fell. For the first time in months, I saw genuine recognition, a flash of understanding, almost fear. He couldn't argue with the evidence. He couldn't rewrite the past. I didn't think it would hurt you this much," he whispered. I took a deep breath. "It does hurt me, and it's not just about the past, it's about how we move forward. I need to know. Are you willing to be completely honest? Not half-truths, not omissions, no excuses?" Mason's silence was telling. He nodded slowly, but it wasn't enough. I realized that no amount of promises could erase the months of deception. The trust we had built had been fractured, and the repair would require more than apologies. It required accountability and boundaries I couldn't yet trust him to uphold. In that moment, I understood my own worth. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't obligated to endure betrayal because of shared history or fear of confrontation. I had survived heartbreak, trauma, and betrayal before, alone and with support. I could survive this too. That evening, I made a decision. I would take a step back. I would set boundaries, demand transparency, and consider whether this relationship could continue on terms of honesty and respect. If Mason couldn't meet those terms, I would not compromise my integrity or my peace of mind. For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of control return. The weight of uncertainty lifted slightly, replaced by purpose. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I had chosen my footing. I would not be passive. I would not allow secrecy to dictate my life. And for the first time in months, I could breathe. The days that followed were a whirlwind of confrontation, revelation, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of the life I thought I knew. Once I had confronted Mason with evidence, the facade he had built for months began to crumble. The secrecy, the omissions, and the carefully curated appearances could no longer hold against facts and accountability. Mason tried to explain, to soften the blow with words that once might have comforted me. "It wasn't like that," he said repeatedly. "It's just friendship. You're overreacting." But even as he spoke, I saw the fissures in his calmness. The defensiveness that had shielded him for months now faltered under the weight of his own admissions. Each word he tried to use to justify his actions only made the truth clearer. The betrayal was real, deliberate, and emotional. The consequences spread quickly. Our mutual friends, once neutral, had to pick sides. Some of them, unaware of the months of deception, assumed I had overreacted. Others, who had noticed the subtle signs of secrecy before, validated my concerns and quietly stepped back from Mason. The social circle that had once felt warm and secure became tense, fractured. The casual camaraderie at gatherings disappeared, replaced by awkward silences and half smiles that carried unspoken judgment. At home, the tension was even more palpable. Mason's attempts to return to normalcy felt forced. I could no longer look at him with the same trust or ease. Every shared glance reminded me of the months of hidden coffee dates, messages, and casual laughs he had preserved as secrets. The house that had been our sanctuary became a pressure cooker of unresolved emotions and unspoken accusations. Even Mason's family felt the impact. Parents and siblings, who had trusted him implicitly, began to see the discrepancies in his stories. Casual questions about the anniversary party, group gatherings, and interactions with Levi slowly peeled back the layers of concealment. Conversations that were once lighthearted now carried the weight of judgment, disappointment, and surprise. The dynamics shifted. Mason's credibility, built over years of charm and reliability, started to falter under scrutiny. I, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of empowerment despite the chaos. The betrayal had hurt, yes, deeply, but it also clarified what I needed to preserve: my self-respect, my integrity, and my right to demand honesty. I realized that stepping back didn't mean abandoning the relationship entirely. It meant reclaiming control over my own life and emotions. I was no longer a passive participant in a narrative that had been manipulated around me. I could choose my response, set boundaries, and determine the pace of reconciliation or separation. I began to document everything: the hidden meetings, the private messages, the excuses and half-truths, both for my own clarity and as a safeguard. Writing became a tool for processing, a way to externalize the betrayal so it wouldn't consume me from the inside. Each note reinforced a simple truth: I had done nothing wrong in seeking honesty, transparency, and respect. In parallel, I saw Mason's world shift. The trust others had placed in him began to waver. Friends who had once celebrated his personality now questioned his judgment. Mutual connections started asking uncomfortable questions, probing for details that Mason had tried to keep hidden. Even those closest to him could see the gap between what he had presented publicly and the reality of his actions. Through all of this, I felt a cautious strength growing. The anger and disappointment, while painful, became a catalyst for self-awareness and clarity. I realized that healing wasn't about forcing reconciliation. It was about reclaiming autonomy and making decisions aligned with my values. Mason's fallout mirrored my own internal reclamation. As his credibility faltered, my resolve strengthened. By the end of the month, the emotional fallout was evident on all fronts. Relationships once assumed to be stable were strained. Trust had been fractured in multiple directions, and the equilibrium we had taken for granted was gone. I could no longer ignore the impact of the months of secrecy, not just on me, but on the broader network of people who trusted both of us. Yet amidst the chaos, I felt a quiet sense of resolution. The truth, painful as it was, had surfaced. I had asserted my boundaries, demanded honesty, and refused to compromise my integrity. Mason's choices had consequences, and those consequences were unfolding naturally. I did not seek revenge. I did not manipulate or retaliate. I simply stood firm in my truth, letting the consequences of deception fall where they would. For the first time in weeks, I could envision a life where I was not defined by his secrecy or my betrayal-induced anxiety. The fallout, though difficult, had cleared the path for clarity, empowerment, and the possibility of moving forward, whether together or apart. In the months that followed, the storm finally began to settle. Mason and I had long conversations, some calm, some heated, all necessary. He admitted, finally, that the secrecy had been a mistake, that his fear of conflict had blinded him to the impact of his actions. I listened, not to forgive immediately, but to understand the full scope of what had happened, and most importantly, to understand my own needs and boundaries. I learned, painfully, that love alone cannot sustain a relationship built on deception. Trust is the foundation, and without it, even the deepest affection becomes fragile. Mason's actions had forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding, that my peace of mind and integrity could never be negotiable. I realized that being strong doesn't mean never being hurt. It means standing firm in your truth even when the hurt is raw. In reclaiming myself, I found freedom. I reestablished routines that nurtured my mental and emotional health. I spent more time with friends who supported me unconditionally, pursued hobbies that gave me joy, and reflected on what I truly wanted in a partner and in life. I stopped replaying the betrayal over and over in my head. Instead, I focused on lessons learned: vigilance, self-respect, and the courage to demand honesty. Mason and I eventually reached a quiet understanding. We wouldn't continue our marriage as it had been. The trust that once held us together was too fractured. But we parted not in hatred, but in clarity. There was no need for revenge, no need to vilify. The truth had spoken for itself. Looking back, I understand now that the hardest moments often become the most defining. The betrayal, the secrecy, the heartbreak, they forced me to confront my values, to assert my boundaries, and to honor myself even when it felt impossible. I emerged not bitter, but empowered. For anyone watching, for anyone living through deceit or dishonesty in a relationship, your instincts matter. Your peace of mind matters. Trust, once broken, cannot be patched with words alone. And sometimes, walking away or standing firm does not signify defeat, but courage. I am Brianna, 34, and I am stronger because I refuse to compromise my integrity. I am learning to love fully again, but this time with my eyes wide open, my boundaries clear, and my heart guarded by the lessons I refuse to forget. The anniversary that had once symbolized love and joy will always carry its scars, but it also carries a profound truth. Honesty and self-respect are worth more than any celebration, any party, or any fleeting illusion of peace. I am free, and for the first time in months, I feel whole.